The laughter began in the back row of the Greyhaven Municipal Hall and moved forward like rain across a slate roof. Eleanor Stroud stood beneath the borough clock, with her rolled drawings under one arm and her father's brass calipers in her gloved hand, while Philip Cresswell allowed the sound to gather before he raised his palm for silence. "Miss Stroud has copied pipe since she was 16, he told the condemnation committee. That does not make her a mechanic, and it certainly does not qualify her to operate a public aquarium." He spoke gently, as if sparing her further embarrassment. That manner had served him well in the 9 months since Leonard Stroud's death. At the Stroud Engine Works, he had called Eleanor a grieving niece when she protested that the new tidal circulation engine had been built from her drawings. Before the patent office, he had called her Leonard's copyist. That morning, when the locks on the rooms above the works were changed and her mother's trunk set in the alley, he had called the eviction an unfortunate necessity. Now the committee clerk read the final item in Leonard's will. Eleanor received Greyhaven Marine Rooms, a shuttered aquarium at the east end of the harbour, together with its unpaid rates, its condemned seawall, and every obligation attached to the property. Philip received the profitable engine works and the patent application bearing his own name. The alderman at the centre of the table pushed a red-bordered notice toward her. "The eastern retaining wall has shifted 4 inches. You have 15 days to brace it to the borough engineer's satisfaction. Failing that, demolition will proceed at the owner's expense." "And the amount presently owed?" Eleanor asked. £38, 11 shillings, excluding demolition. Her mother had £6 hidden in the hem of a winter cloak. Eleanor possessed 2 sovereigns, a tool chest, and wages Philip had refused to pay. The arithmetic was meant to crush her more efficiently than the laughter had. Philip stepped from the public benches in a black coat cut so perfectly that no rain seemed willing to mark it. "There is no need for Miss Stroud to suffer under my late partner's eccentricity. I will assume the deed and every debt. I shall also permit Mrs. Stroud to occupy her old rooms until Christmas." Margaret Stroud sat rigid beside the aisle, her face colourless beneath a widow's bonnet. The offer would give them shelter. It would also put Leonard's last property, and whatever reason he had for leaving it to Eleanor, into Philip's hands before sunset. "Why would you want a condemned aquarium?" Eleanor asked. "To spare the borough an eyesore. For £38? His smile did not alter. Compassion is seldom economical. The clerk had already uncapped his pen when a chair scraped near the door. Samuel Burke, former keeper of the Marine Rooms, rose in a salt-stiff coat. At 55, he looked made from rope, tobacco, and harbour weather. "Tell them about number 4, he said. The alderman frowned. "This is a property hearing, Mr. Burke. Tank number 4 was drained when the rooms closed. 9 months empty, and its floor never dried. Salt mark climbs when the harbour tide falls. No common leak works uphill." Eleanor felt the calipers tighten in her hand. A falling tide meant falling external pressure. If moisture rose inside a drained vessel at the same time, something beneath it was drawing rather than leaking. Philip's gaze flicked toward Samuel. It was the smallest movement, but Eleanor had spent years reading the moment when a machine betrayed strain before a casting cracked. "My offer," he said, "was made in kindness. Since Miss Stroud chooses suspicion, I withdraw it. I have chosen nothing yet." "Then choose quickly." "Your 15 days began at 9 o'clock. Eleanor signed for the deed. The nib tore the paper on the final stroke of her name. By noon, she and Margaret were walking east beneath a sky the colour of pewter. A hired barrow carried their trunks, blankets, kettle, and Eleanor's japanned tool chest. Beyond the fish market, the respectable shops ended, and the harbour narrowed between warehouses blackened by coal smoke. Greyhaven Marine Rooms stood where the quay bent toward the open sea, a long, pale building of stone and iron glasswork, its central lantern roof broken, its entrance canopy sagging, and its eastern end sunk toward a wall stained by decades of tides. Faded letters above the doors still promised wonders of the British seas. Someone had crossed out wonders with tar. Samuel waited with a key as long as Eleanor's palm. Mr. Cresswell sent men through twice after Mr. Stroud died, he said. Said they were valuers. Valuers don't carry Stilson wrenches. Did you see what they touched? Main stopcocks, pump room, and the old intake hatch. They found no machinery worth lifting. Inside, their steps woke a cold echo. Dust veiled the ticket desk. Painted seagrass peeled from the walls. 6 exhibition tanks stood along the central gallery, their thick glass clouded with dried mineral tracks. The air smelled of wet lime, iron, and something sharper than ordinary decay. Eleanor first inspected shelter rather than mystery. The keeper's office had a sound ceiling, a small grate, and a door that could be barred. The adjoining preparation room had a lead sink, but no running water. She marked cracked lintels in chalk and tied cord across the unsafe north gallery. Margaret opened the shutters and said nothing about the 2 rooms they had lost that morning. At 4, Samuel led Eleanor to tank number 4. It was lower than the grand display tanks, built of glazed cream brick with a mosaic floor sloping toward a bronze drain. Every surface was dusty except a dark band 2 inches wide along the lower wall. White salt crystals feathered above it. The harbour tide was ebbing. Eleanor knelt, pressed blotting paper against the damp band, and watched it darken. She marked the upper edge with pencil. Half an hour later, the moisture had climbed the width of her smallest fingernail. Perhaps water enters from a cracked supply pipe, Margaret said from the gallery. Then the mark should follow the water level outside or remain steady under pressure. It rises as pressure falls. Eleanor placed one end of a thread near the open drain. The thread leaned inward, trembled, then drew flat against the bronze grill. Samuel crossed himself before pretending he had only scratched his beard. Air is moving, Eleanor said. Very little, but in the wrong direction for a dead pipe. She removed the drain grill. 2 screw heads were bright beneath old tarnish. Fresh crescent scars marked the bronze. Someone had opened it recently and fastened it again. From below came a faint, measured sound. Not water dripping, but a hollow breath that lengthened as the sea withdrew. That night the wind worried the broken roof, while Eleanor and Margaret slept in the keeper's office beneath borrowed sailcloth. Eleanor woke twice to calculate loads in darkness. 4 inches of movement in a tide wall could not be undone in 15 days. It could only be arrested. Timber braces, iron dogs, rubble packing, and paid hands would consume money they did not have. At dawn she made 3 lists: work required for safety, work that might earn coin, and questions that could wait. The damp tank appeared on the 3rd list. By breakfast, she had moved it to the 2nd. Greyhaven had not forgotten the woman Philip called a copyist. It had merely remembered her incorrectly. At the timber yard, the foreman addressed Samuel, while Eleanor described the lengths and angles she needed. At the ironmonger's, the proprietor offered household nails until she set a cracked valve body on his counter, measured its distorted seat, and explained how his apprentice could turn a replacement bush without wasting brass. He stopped smiling and extended 7 days' credit. The timber yard gave none. Eleanor spent 1 sovereign on sound larch balks salvaged from a dismantled pier. Nessa Dorr, a broad-shouldered fisherwoman with a red scarf and hands scarred by line, lent a cart after hearing that Eleanor meant to brace the aquarium rather than sell it to Cresswell. "My Elsie used to stand before the ray tank until Burke swept her out," Nessa said. "Place taught the child more than the parish copybook did. Doesn't mean I trust a wall that's leaning toward France." "You should not," Eleanor replied. "Keep to the chalked paths." That answer earned the first flicker of approval. For 3 days, Eleanor worked where everyone could see her. She cleared loose masonry without disturbing bearing stones, fitted temporary shores across the eastern service corridor, and bolted diagonal braces into sockets Samuel swore had not been used since the building opened. She hired 2 dock carpenters for 12 shillings a day, only after showing them the money. Margaret cleaned the office, boiled tea, and kept a strict account in Leonard's old visitor book after tearing out the printed page headed Sharks and Monsters. On the 4th morning, borough engineer Frederick Mott arrived with a level, an assistant, and the expression of a man prepared to document failure. Eleanor handed him measurements taken at high and low tide, each witnessed by Samuel. "A lady's pencil cannot reduce thrust," he said. "No, the braces do that. The pencil tells us whether they have." He set his level independently. The wall had moved less than 1/8 of an inch through the morning tide. It was not safe, but it was no longer accelerating. Mott walked the brace line twice. "Maintain this arrangement. Submit a permanent scheme by the 15th day. I will postpone no order on sentiment. Then postpone it on measurements." He looked at her at last. "Continue taking them." The reprieve was not approval, yet word travelled through the market that Miss Stroud had made the borough engineer measure twice. By evening, 3 boat owners had brought faulty bilge valves to the keeper's office. Eleanor repaired 2 and refused the 3rd because its body was cracked beyond honesty. She earned 9 shillings and a loaf of rye bread. The aquarium began to serve as a workshop before it could serve as a home. A plank over 2 trestles became her bench. Her father's calipers lay beside files, taps, lampblack, and a small pressure gauge rescued from the pump room. Elsie Dorr appeared after lessons and watched from the doorway until Eleanor showed her how to feel a burr without cutting a finger. "Mr. Cresswell says women mistake neat lines for engineering," Elsie said. "A neat line can still be wrong. A dirty hand can still be ignorant. Measure the thing itself." Together, they tested tank 4. Eleanor sealed a sheet of oiled cloth over the drain, fitted the gauge through a cork, and hung a strip of tissue beside a pinhole. Near high tide, the needle barely stirred. As the tide ebbed, it crept below 0. The tissue dimpled inward. Somewhere beneath the floor, a connected space was losing pressure without a powered pump. Samuel brought his keeper's notebooks from a chest under his bed. The early volumes recorded herring, anemones, crabs, and the complaints of visitors splashed by the seal. Later pages contained columns of tide times, water clarity, odors, and the number of hours shellfish remained vigorous in wicker baskets. Several leaves had been cut out cleanly. "Why shellfish?" Eleanor asked. Nessa answered from the doorway. "Because 6 of us paid Leonard Stroud to try keeping mussels clean before market. Harbour mud fouled half a catch when the drains ran. We never saw an agreement, only his promise that the marine rooms would take baskets at low tide. Did it work? Sometimes the mussels held better, customers stopped bringing them back. Then Cresswell said the pump coal cost more than our catch and closed the trial." Samuel stabbed one blunt finger at the columns. "Coal pump wasn't running on these dates. I wrote a P when it ran." Eleanor compared tide times with the surviving basket records. The strongest results clustered after long ebb tides, when water was being pulled out of the harbour rather than forced inward. The machinery had done useful work, while apparently idle. She followed visible pipes from the tanks, tapping each elbow and noting tone, diameter, and direction. She did not possess a plan, she built one from measurement. The supply main entered from the pump room but divided beneath the floor. One branch should have ended at tank 4. Its hollow note continued toward the sea wall. At the tank's threshold, she found 3 cream floor tiles that rang differently. They were not loose. Their backs, visible through a broken edge, showed a porous red body beneath the glaze. Each carried the impressed mark H and F, Whitby. "Filter tiles," she said, "not decorative ones." And Samuel shook his head. Filters were gravel boxes in the cellar. The ones you were meant to notice were. On the 6th day, Philip sent a solicitor's clerk with a notice. As holder of the Engine Works patent application, Cresswell and Stroud claimed every experimental apparatus Leonard had installed on outside premises. Eleanor must surrender any mechanical equipment discovered at Greyhaven. The works no longer bears my uncle's name, she told the clerk. Commercial usage is not altered by mourning, he replied, nor is ownership altered by stationery. Tell Mr. Cresswell the deed includes fixtures within the property boundary. If he disputes that, he may identify the apparatus he claims. The clerk had no description. Philip knew enough to fear a machine and too little to name it. That afternoon, the town crier repeated a warning against entering the condemned building. Customers stopped bringing valves. Someone painted female folly across the boarded ticket window. Margaret scrubbed until her fingers bled, but tar only spread across the grain. "We can still leave," she said softly. £6 will rent one room inland. Eleanor looked down the ruined gallery. Her braces held. Her gauge recorded a steady breath under the floor. For years, she had allowed other men to decide which of her measurements counted. Leaving would save Margaret from rain and gossip, but it would return the only unexplained thing Leonard had left her to the man who already owned her labor. "Give me until the inspection," she said. "If I cannot show a lawful use and a permanent scheme, we go before demolition, not after." Margaret tied a clean rag around her raw hand, then show it properly. At the next low tide, Samuel unlocked a service hatch behind the eastern stair. It opened not into a secret chamber, but onto a narrow intake gallery shown by an iron doorframe and forgotten beneath layers of limewash. The first 6 feet were filled with fallen plaster and seaweed. Eleanor shored the lintel before letting anyone pass. Beyond it, brick steps descended beside the sea-wall into air cold enough to ache in her teeth. The passage stopped above a black channel connected to the harbour. Along one wall stood a broad iron vessel shaped like an inverted bell. Earthenware pipes entered its base. Copper tubes rose from its crown toward the tanks. A rack of porous tiles filled a brick trough, their lower edges dark with moving water. No treasure waited there. There was only a machine built into masonry, ugly with salt and beautiful in its economy. As the external water fell, the channel drew through a narrowing throat. Air hissed into the bell. Water climbed the sight glass by inches, then spilled through a return pipe without piston or furnace. The falling tide was priming the circulation. Eleanor leaned close to the relief spindle. The original triangular notch had been filed deeper on one face, correcting the ratio between water draw and admitted air. She knew the uneven double stroke. At 23, she had made it on a trial valve after her calculated opening caused the siphon to break. Philip had mocked the mistake before taking the corrected dimensions to Leonard. Beside the spindle, however, a newer iron collar had been tightened hard against the relief arm. Its wrench marks were bright. The arm could not move through its full range. "That will choke the prime at a strong ebb," Eleanor said. Samuel lifted his lamp. Cresswell's valuers? Someone who knew which movement to prevent, but not why the correction mattered. She did not loosen it. If Philip had placed it, its position was evidence. She sketched the assembly, measured every stop, and had Samuel and Nessa sign the page. Behind the air bell, she found empty bolt holes where a second sight glass and a bronze regulating weight had been removed. The system was real, but an incomplete demonstration could be made to fail. Then Elsie's voice came faintly from above. "Miss Stroud, the tide has turned." Water entered the channel, covering the lowest step with shocking speed. Eleanor gathered the drawings, while Samuel lifted the lamp. The relief arm shuddered against the collar. From somewhere inside the wall came a hard metallic knock. The system had begun another cycle, and the sea wall answered as if struck from within. Eleanor drove everyone up the steps before following. In the gallery she waited through the flood tide with one hand on the eastern wall. The next knock was softer, then ceased. When Mott arrived in response to her note, she showed him the iron collar from a distance and the measurements without claiming more than she could prove. A blocked relief could send a pressure pulse into a pipe buried through the wall, he said. It could also be an effect of settlement. You are proposing to preserve a mechanism that may be worsening the defect. I propose isolating it until I know. And your permanent wall scheme. Eleanor unrolled a drawing of raking shores tied to internal crossbeams with a rubble buttress to protect the exposed footing until spring. It was triage, not repair. Mott calculated loads in silence, altered the angle of one brace, and estimated 26 pounds for timber, iron, lime, and labour. I have 3 pounds, 14 shillings, she said. Then your arithmetic is sound and your wall remains condemned. He gave her 5 days to obtain materials or a guarantee. Philip had already purchased the salvage rights to the demolition rubble through an intermediary. If the order proceeded, he would gain the aquarium's fixtures as scrap for less than the cost of disputing the deed. The following morning brought a different emergency. Nessa arrived with Elsie and 2 wicker baskets covered by wet sacking. A red notice had closed the lower market beds after sewer water entered the harbour during repairs. 20 families had catches they could neither sell nor keep alive until clean water returned. If these die, the week's rent dies with them, Nessa said. Burke says the old trial washed the harbour taste from mussels. Eleanor had planned to sell her father's calipers that day to pay a deposit on braces. The temporary cleansing cycle would require tile repairs, a replacement regulating weight, and control of the seized relief. Worse, operating before the wall was fully secured carried risk. Miss Elspeth Fane, a marine naturalist who had once supplied labels to the aquarium, came from Scarborough after Samuel wrote to her. She inspected the shellfish, smelled water from the clean outer harbour, and refused to offer the certainty Nessa wanted. We cannot see every cause of illness, Miss Fane said. We can compare water, survival, odour, and condition. We can discard any doubtful basket. That is not the same as declaring all danger gone. Eleanor drew a small controlled circuit using 2 preparation vats, the intact portion of the tile bed and the air bell. No display tank would carry the load. The system would admit outer harbour water on the flood, pass it through settling and porous ceramic, then aerate and circulate it during the ebb. They would test one marked basket beside an untreated control and keep both from market until the town surgeon examined them. The wall comes first, Margaret said when they were alone. If the trial works, the fishers may pay for each basket. That could secure the wall. And if it fails? We lose money we cannot spare. Margaret opened her sewing box. Beneath black thread lay the 6 pounds from her cloak hem. Your father taught you to measure, because he said figures were a defense against loud men. He did not teach you to watch neighbors lose food while a useful pipe sat idle. Spend 4, keep 2, so we may still leave. Eleanor sold neither the calipers nor hope disguised as certainty. She bought 2 lengths of copper tube, paid a potter to cut replacement filter slabs from the nearest matching clay, and hired the dock carpenters for 1 more day. Nessa's group supplied sand, baskets and labour. Mott approved operation only after Eleanor added a rupture sheet of thin lead to relieve abnormal pressure and posted Samuel at the intake valve through every tide. On the 9th day, they loosened the obstructing collar in the presence of Mott and Mr. Abel Quist, a solicitor, who recorded its position and fresh marks. Eleanor hung a temporary regulating weight calculated from the valve area. The flood tide filled the settling vat. When the sea turned, the throat began to draw. Air entered the bell in a steady silver chain visible through the surviving sight glass. Water moved across the preparation vat without coal, steam, or hand pump. Tank 4's damp band rose, but now Eleanor understood it. Moisture was being pulled through the porous floor tiles by a slight negative pressure beneath them. The tank acted as the upper face of a filter plenum. Its apparent leak was the signature of the ebb cycle. For 36 hours, Miss Fane and the town surgeon compared the marked muscles. The treated basket kept its valves tight, lost the sour mud odor, and survived better than the control. The surgeon permitted sale only after cooking and only from beds not directly affected by the sewer release. It was a narrow finding, responsibly stated. In the market, it was enough to save part of the catch. Nessa placed 8 shillings on Eleanor's bench. Other women added what they could, until there were £3 in a chipped exhibition bowl. Not charity, Nessa said. Advance payment for 12 more tides when the beds reopen. Eleanor used it as security at the timber yard. Mott accepted Quist's written guarantee for the remainder, backed by prospective cleansing fees. On the 14th day, new shores pressed into place along the eastern corridor. On the 15th, Mott suspended demolition for 3 months, subject to weekly measurements and a permanent repair plan. The victory was modest enough to be real. Margaret slept 1 full night. Customers returned to Eleanor's bench. Elsie kept tide columns in a hand-ruled book, and Samuel painted over female folly with grey primer. The words remained visible in certain light, but no longer governed the door. Philip came 2 days later, while the gallery held the smell of hot pitch and tea. He examined the braces without touching them. "You have confused a postponement with ownership," he said. "The deed gives you stone. My patent gives me the process. Every penny earned from it belongs to Cresswell Works." "Your application describes a steam-assisted circulation pump," Eleanor said. "This system uses tidal draw. My application includes all derivative arrangements." "Then you knew what stood here when you called it an eyesore." He glanced toward Elsie, who was copying valve measurements at the bench. Children should not be present in condemned industrial premises, nor should unlicensed food treatment occur there. I have informed the sanitary committee. His objective was clearer now. He needed the system stopped before a successful public cycle linked it to Eleanor's work, yet he could not describe it without admitting prior knowledge. "My uncle sold you my design," she said. "Did he also sell you these rooms?" For the first time, Philip's control thinned. "Leonard sold me what mattered. His guilt made him sentimental about ruins." He left before she could ask what guilt he meant. Quist searched probate papers and found that Leonard had purchased the Marine Rooms personally 6 years earlier. The deed included an intake easement through the harbour wall and all fixtures fixed to the freehold. That protected the installed masonry and pipes, but not necessarily the invention. Philip's patent application, if granted broadly, could prevent Eleanor from operating what she owned. "We need provenance," Quist said. "Not simply that the apparatus exists, but who devised it, when, and under what agreement." Samuel's missing notebook pages would not provide it. Eleanor returned to physical evidence. H&F of Whitby had supplied the filter tiles. A surviving invoice might date the installation. The Port Authority recorded work through harbour walls. Miss Fane remembered submitting observations to a scientific society, but had retained no copy. Each thread led outside the aquarium, which was why Philip's men had failed to remove it. Before Eleanor could follow those threads, the sanitary committee issued an order suspending shellfish work pending a formal hearing. Philip's complaint alleged stagnant tanks, experimental apparatus, and danger to the public. The order was inconvenient, but lawful. Eleanor shut the intake, labelled every basket, and refunded 2 women from the wall fund. 3 nights later, someone entered with a borough clearance warrant. Philip arrived at dawn with a sanitary inspector, 4 labourers, and Caleb Voss, a foreman from Cresswell Works. The warrant authorized removal of standing foul water and obstructions. It did not authorize alteration of machinery. Philip interpreted the difference, while Eleanor was held at the entrance by a constable, uncertain whom to obey. "The lower channel contains harbour water," Eleanor said. It is not standing. The work must wait for Mott. The order says immediate, Philip replied. You have already endangered the market with an unproved contrivance. His men descended with sacks of quick-setting cement and timber plugs. Eleanor heard hammering below the gallery. Samuel ran for Mott. Quist was at court 20 miles away. The inspector peered into a preparation vat, apparently relieved to find no shellfish, while Philip directed Voss toward the relief branch. You are sealing an active pressure path, Eleanor said. We are excluding contaminated water. The tide had begun a strong spring ebb. Eleanor watched the gauge at tank 4 fall faster than before. A tissue strip snapped toward the drain. Philip had chosen the hour because he expected the system to fail under load, not because he understood where the failure would travel. Voss emerged from the stair. Bypass is open, and waste branch stopped, sir. Eleanor went cold. Opening the bypass, while stopping the relief, would let the falling tide pull directly on the plenum until air found another way in. Clear the eastern gallery, she shouted. Now, Philip told the constable she was creating panic. Then the air bell gave a deep concussion. Tank 4's mosaic floor cracked from drain to threshold. Water vanished from the damp band as pressure plunged below it. A second blow traveled through the buried pipe and struck the weakened sea wall. The eastern corridor shifted with a sound like crockery breaking inside a cupboard. One brace kicked free. Eleanor seized Elsie by the shoulders and thrust her toward Margaret. Samuel, returning through the door, helped the dock carpenters drag the inspector clear. Masonry fell across the service stair. Cold harbour water burst through a joint at ankle height, carrying lime and rust. Eleanor reached the main isolation wheel. It had been chained open under the warrant. She could not turn it. With her father's calipers, she measured the gap between chain and spoke, chose a narrow, cold chisel, and drove out the weakest link, while water climbed to her knees. The wheel fought her until Nessa and one carpenter joined the rim. Together, they closed the intake. The concussion ceased, but a section of outer facing collapsed into the channel. No one died. The inspector's wrist was broken, Samuel's shoulder badly bruised, and 20 feet of gallery floor lay under muddy water. That restraint of fate did not restrain the newspapers. By afternoon, the Greyhaven Gazette reported that an untrained woman had activated experimental machinery in a condemned public building, causing a harbour breach. Philip produced the clearance warrant and said his men had attempted to make the site safe. Voss swore the bypass had already been open. The constable remembered Eleanor shouting, but not her warning's exact words. Mott found the cemented relief branch beneath fallen masonry and could not immediately determine when it had been blocked. The borough reinstated demolition for 7 days hence. The sanitary committee prohibited all operation. Quist warned that damage claims might exceed £200. Worse, Samuel's tied notebooks disappeared from the keeper's office during the confusion. Eleanor's pressure gauge had shattered. Rain soaked half her drawings where the office ceiling opened along an old crack. For the first time, Tank 4 was completely dry. Eleanor stood inside it that evening, looking at the pale floor where dampness had once drawn the shape of hidden circulation. The anomaly that had given her a claim was gone. Her controlled trial could be called an accident. Her witnesses had seen results, but not authorship. Her own correction on the relief spindle proved only that she had once touched it. Margaret found her there after dark. "The inland train leaves at 7, she said. "I have enough for 2 fares." Eleanor expected relief. Instead, she heard Philip's sentence, "Leonard sold me what mattered." If she left, Philip would purchase the rubble, remove the corrected spindle, and let his patent become the only surviving account. "He did not steal one machine," Eleanor said. "He stole the history of everyone who tested it. That history cannot all have been kept in one room." At sunrise, she sent 5 letters. One went to Hargreaves and Fenn, tile makers of Whitby. One to the Port Authority. One to the Northern Society of Mechanical Arts. One to Miss Fane's former publisher. The fifth went to the women whose baskets appeared in Samuel's surviving totals, asking for dates, payments, and anything they had kept. Then she built a small apparatus on the ticket counter from glass tubing, a coopered barrel, 2 clay tiles, and a valve cut from scrap brass. It could not cleanse a market catch or brace a wall. It could demonstrate exactly one fact: whether her corrected air admission would keep a siphon primed under a falling head. Elsie ruled fresh-tied columns. Nessa gathered signed statements. Samuel, his arm in a sling, remembered that he had submitted duplicate monthly reports to Leonard because Cresswell demanded coal accounts. Margaret searched old household receipts, not for a miraculous letter, but for the ordinary trail of paper created when men believed women would never read it together. Answers came unevenly. Hargreaves and Fenn had lost its early books in a kiln fire, but an elderly partner recognized the stamp and sent a sample catalogue showing Stroud porous marine slabs, offered in 1886. The Port Authority found a permit for 2 6-inch conduits through the east wall, signed by Leonard as purchaser and witnessed by Caleb Voss as installing foreman. Miss Fane's publisher located a printer's proof describing shellfish trials conducted by Miss E. Stroud's tidal aeration arrangement, though the article had been shortened before publication. The Mechanical Arts Society sent the most important packet. 7 years earlier, it had received a sealed drawing from Eleanor with a 1 shilling registration fee, a customary deposit used by mechanics seeking to establish a date before approaching manufacturers. The clerk had retained both receipt and drawing. Her deposited version showed the first valve geometry, the one that lost prime at strong ebb, and a note in her hand promising a corrected ratio after further trial. At first the error seemed a weakness. Then Quist obtained a certified copy of Philip's patent specification. It reproduced Eleanor's early ratio exactly. His drawing widened the bypass, but omitted the deeper relief notch she had made after testing. On paper, his machine could not survive the very spring ebb that had damaged Greyhaven. "He copied before you corrected it," Quist said. "He copied what he understood least," Eleanor replied. The installed spindle bore the correction, and the aquarium's prior successful cycles proved it worked. Yet the spindle remained behind fallen masonry. Mott would permit 1 supervised recovery operation if the borough delayed demolition. For that, they needed a forum where the patent, property damage, and public contract mattered more than Philip's newspaper account. The opportunity came from the Harbour Board. Before the breach, Cresswell Works had bid to supply 4 steam pumps for new fish market holding tanks at a cost of £600 plus coal. The board postponed the award because Philip's patent claim was now disputed and because his foreman appeared on the conduit permit. Quist petitioned for a combined public inquiry into the contract, the clearance work, and the marine rooms easement. Philip opposed it, then agreed when refusal began to look like fear. He expected Eleanor to arrive with a broken aquarium and a toy barrel. He did not know that Voss had visited Samuel after midnight. The foreman had not confessed from virtue. Philip had withheld his wages and blamed him for the breach. Voss brought the work order, directing him to immobilize the waste relief and expose the proprietary bypass before the clearance inspection. Philip had written no name, but the instruction was in his hand and matched a memorandum at the works. Voss admitted fitting the earlier collar as well. He had been told it prevented trespassers operating the system. "Did you know it would strike the wall?" Eleanor asked. "No, miss. Thought the siphon would simply break. Mr. Cresswell said your calculations always failed at the turn. Mine once did. That is why the valve was corrected." Voss looked at the sling on Samuel's arm. "I'll say it before the board. But I want it known I warned him the waste branch was drawing hard." Eleanor did not forgive him. She wrote down his exact words and had Quist witness them. The inquiry filled the municipal hall more completely than the condemnation hearing had. Fish merchants stood beside engineers from Leeds. The women who sold mussels occupied 2 rows in clean aprons and market shawls. Philip sat at counsel's table with his patent specification bound in blue ribbon, while Eleanor placed no drawing before her that had not already been copied and witnessed. The harbour board began with ownership. Quist produced Leonard's deed, the intake easement, and the port permit, identifying the apparatus as a fixture installed within Greyhaven Marine Rooms. Philip's barrister argued that the physical pipes might belong to the property while their operation infringed Cresswell's invention. "Then let us examine the invention," the board chairman said. Philip described a circulation system in which falling harbour water assisted a pump and reduced coal consumption. He spoke elegantly of head, pressure, and economy, until the chairman asked why his commercial bid specified 4 steam engines large enough to perform every cycle without tidal assistance. "Reliability requires redundancy," Philip said. "Does your patented valve remain primed through a spring ebb?" "Certainly." Eleanor was called to the demonstration table. Her small barrel stood on a raised frame, connected through glass tubes to a lower vessel. One brass valve had been cut to the ratio in Philip's filed specification. A second carried the corrected notch measured from the Greyhaven spindle before the breach. She did not ask the board to trust an unexplained performance. She showed the 2 valves separately, gave their areas, and invited the borough engineer to choose which one she fitted first. Mott selected the patent valve and sealed it himself. As water fell from the upper barrel, the siphon began. Air collected at the high bend faster than the valve could release it. The stream thinned, shuddered, and broke. The lower vessel remained half empty. Philip leaned toward his barrister. "A bench model cannot represent harbour conditions." "That is true," Eleanor said. "It cannot prove the full Greyhaven capacity. It can test the relationship your specification claims." Mott fitted the corrected valve. This time, the admitted air and water draw found balance. The siphon recovered after each deliberate interruption and emptied the barrel to its marked line. Miss Fane explained how that stable cycle had passed water through porous slabs and restored air to holding vats without a continuous coal pump. She submitted her printer's proof and observations. Nessa and 4 other market women testified to their payments, basket markings, and improved survival during the early trials and Eleanor's recent controlled use. Philip's barrister attacked the evidence as anecdote. Eleanor agreed that it did not prove freedom from every source of illness. "It proves a practical improvement worthy of supervised trials. More importantly today, it proves the Marine Room system had a defined public purpose before Mr. Cresswell claimed it as scrap." The board opened the Mechanical Arts Society packet. The dated drawing bore Eleanor's full name and the imperfect first ratio. Philip's patent repeated not only its dimensions but a small copying error in the label of the air branch, 3/8 of an inch, where the scale clearly showed 5/16. Eleanor had corrected the label in later workshop sheets. Philip had copied the deposit or a tracing made from it before the correction. "Mr. Cresswell," the chairman asked, "how did an error deposited by Miss Stroud 7 years ago enter an invention you claim to have devised independently?" Philip said Leonard had provided working papers belonging to the partnership. That answer surrendered the independence of his claim without establishing any assignment from Eleanor. Quist produced the work's wage books, which listed her as a draftswoman paid weekly, not as a partner's apprentice under a contract assigning inventions. There was no signed transfer. Voss then identified the installed mechanism, his own signature on the conduit permit, and Philip's clearance instructions. Under questioning, he admitted removing the bronze regulating weight and second sight glass during the supposed valuations. They had been stored at Cresswell Works, not discarded. A constable found them there that afternoon under the authority of the inquiry. "Why remove them?" the chairman asked Philip. "To protect proprietary components. Components you have insisted you did not know were present." The quiet that followed was more complete than the laughter at Eleanor's first hearing. Mott described the breach. Blocking the waste relief while opening the bypass had created the pressure collapse. The pre-existing wall weakness increased the damage, but the clearance work had triggered it. Philip's order had exceeded the sanitary warrant. His barrister attempted to place full responsibility on Voss. Voss repeated that he had warned Philip and presented a second worker who heard the exchange. The board did not possess the power to settle every civil claim or grant a patent. It did possess the power to reject Cresswell's pump contract, refer suspected misrepresentation and property damage to the borough solicitor, and recognize who controlled the harbour easement. It did all three. The patent opposition would proceed in London with Eleanor's deposit, physical valve, and witnesses preserved as evidence. Then the chairman turned to the demolition order. Miss Stroud, can the marine rooms be made safe? Yes, in stages, not in 7 days, and not with aquarium receipts that do not yet exist. The eastern facing must be rebuilt at low tides over several months. The lantern roof can wait. The front gallery and preparation rooms can be isolated. At what cost? £184 for the wall and drainage, if the harbour provides access during scheduled works. A further £90 to make one public gallery sound. I will not pretend the whole building can reopen at once. She proposed that the board lease the usable preparation rooms for a 12-month supervised shellfish trial. Fees would be paid per basket by participating sellers, supplemented by a modest market sanitation allowance. A portion of every payment would enter a repair account administered jointly by Quist and the borough treasurer. Miss Fane would oversee observations. Mott would inspect the structure. Eleanor would license no mechanism until authorship was decided. One board member asked why the town should trust her after a breach. Because I warned against the action that caused it, because I closed the intake while others argued, and because every limitation in my proposal is written where you may measure it. The board granted a 6-month stay and approved the lease by 4 votes to 2. One dissenting member announced that an aquarium managed by women would become a sentimental club and a burden. Nessa wrote down his name beside the vote totals. Outside, reporters crowded Eleanor on the hall steps. She refused to call the system miraculous. It was an engine shaped by harbour levels, imperfect trials, tile makers, keepers, market women, and a correction earned through failure. When asked whether she had defeated Philip Cresswell, she said his own specification answered him. The consequences did not arrive in a single triumphant afternoon. Cresswell Works lost credit after the harbour contract was rejected. Philip sold his house to meet security demanded in the property action. The borough court later ordered him to pay for the additional breach damage and return the removed components. His patent application was narrowed beyond commercial use and then abandoned when Leonard's correspondence with the society clerk confirmed that Eleanor had submitted the design. Voss was fined for exceeding the warrant and dismissed from the works. Eleanor did not employ him, though she gave truthful evidence that reduced the charge from deliberate destruction to reckless damage. Leonard's part proved harder to judge. Margaret found a receipt showing he had paid Eleanor's society registration fee, and Quist located a draft partnership account crediting ES Tidal Work before Philip struck the line through. Leonard had recognized her authorship and failed to defend it while alive. Purchasing the marine rooms and leaving them to her had been an attempt at restitution made through property instead of courage. He should have spoken, Eleanor said. Yes, Margaret answered, you need not turn his regret into virtue to make use of what he left. That distinction freed Eleanor from the need either to forgive Leonard entirely or reject every good thing attached to him. She framed no portrait in the workshop. She preserved his documents because they belonged to the truth. Winter work began with the wall. Mott divided it into bays so masons could remove and reset the facing without exposing the full foundation. Harbour labourers built a temporary cofferdam during favourable tides. Eleanor's repair account paid wages every Saturday. When funds ran short in February, she closed the public viewing platform for 3 weeks rather than borrow from a lender tied to Cresswell. The shellfish trial continued in 2 sound rooms. Each basket received a numbered wooden tally. Elsie recorded its bed, arrival tide, time in moving water, condition, and sale outcome. Miss Fane insisted on untreated comparisons and rejected more batches than impatient merchants liked. The system did not purify every catch, and they never claimed it did. It reduced mud, improved holding life, and allowed suspicious lots to be separated before sale. Those measurable benefits persuaded the Harbour Board to renew the lease. Eleanor improved the apparatus without erasing its origins. She installed 2 relief paths, so one obstruction could not repeat the breach. Locking valve covers required signatures from both keeper and mechanic. A float released a warning bell if negative pressure exceeded the safe line. She ordered new porous slabs from Hargreaves and Fenn and had every delivery stamped with the maker and year, where no future owner could mistake it for decoration. By spring, the Marine Rooms employed Samuel as keeper, Nessa as coordinator for the fishers, and 2 masons through the wall season. Margaret ran the ticket desk on Saturdays after the front gallery reopened, with 1 restored tide pool. She charged a penny for children and refused payment from those carrying market tallies. The cracked lantern roof remained covered in canvas, and half the tanks stood empty behind a partition. Visitors saw honest progress rather than instant splendor. Eleanor set 3 benches in the former seal room for evening instruction. Elsie and 4 other young women learned mechanical drawing, filing, pipe fitting, and the discipline of recording a failed test. Men attended too, after the first fishing cooperative required every boat mechanic to understand the new valve locks. No sign over the door promised genius. The rules required clean tools, exact notes, and the courage to report an error before water found it. In June, a letter arrived from London confirming Eleanor's right to the circulation improvements documented before Philip's application. She registered a revised design under her own name and licensed it to 2 coastal holding houses. The agreements reserved a small royalty for the Greyhaven repair account and permitted non-profit Aquaria to build the system at cost. Material value had finally followed authorship, but it did not replace it. The eastern wall was certified stable in September, 11 months after the first hearing. Its new stone remained pale against the weathered building. The town still contained people who called the expense foolish and women incapable. Eleanor no longer mistook unanimous approval for justice. On the anniversary of the condemnation order, the Harbour Board gathered at Tank 4. Its cracked mosaic had been relaid over removable inspection panels. The cream tiles were dry, though the tide outside had begun to fall. Eleanor handed Elsie the valve key. "Set the relief to the first mark," she said. Elsie checked Samuel's tide clock, opened the intake, and watched the vacuum gauge. A soft breath moved beneath the floor. The damp line appeared slowly, not as a haunting stain, but as a measured trace of water passing through clay. In the preparation room, clean harbour water began to circulate around the waiting baskets. At Eleanor's signal, Elsie closed the test branch. Air entered, pressure equalized, and the mosaic dried from the threshold inward. For 9 months the tank had refused to dry because no one had understood what work it was doing. Now it dried on command. Margaret stood beside the public rail in the navy cloak she had once planned to sell for rent. Samuel rang the keeper's bell. Children pressed close to the glass of the restored tide pool, where no exotic monster waited. Only crabs, weed and small silver fish from their own coast, made worth seeing by attention. Eleanor placed her father's calipers on the workshop bench and opened the evening register. Beyond the windows, the falling sea drew breath through the rooms, and the building answered without a blow. Water through tile, air through brass, one useful motion carrying into the next.